The room smelled like money and contempt. Brendan Solis had walked into dozens of rooms like this, high ceilings, floor-to-ceiling glass, the kind of view that made ordinary men feel small before anyone opened their mouth. But he had never walked into one holding a 7-year-old's hand, a faded canvas bag over one shoulder, and the particular kind of exhaustion that comes not from lack of sleep, but from carrying too much for too long. His daughter, Lily, pressed close to his leg. She was wearing her good shoes, the ones with the tiny bow on the strap that she'd picked herself from the thrift store in Barrie, and she held her stuffed rabbit, Percy, against her chest like armor. Brendan had told her 3 times that morning to leave Percy in the truck. 3 times she'd looked at him with those dark, serious eyes and said nothing, just tucked the rabbit tighter under her arm. He hadn't pushed it. After everything they'd been through in the past 14 months, he figured she'd earned the rabbit. The receptionist at the front desk had given Lily a glass of water with a lemon wedge and smiled with the kind of professional warmth that didn't reach the eyes. She'd told Brendan the tryout was on the 32nd floor. He thanked her, took Lily's hand again, and stepped into the elevator. He hadn't planned to bring Lily today. The sitter, Mrs. Kowalski, who lived 2 doors down in the building on Dunlop Street, had called that morning with a bad knee and a lot of apologizing. Brendan had looked at his watch, looked at his daughter eating her toast, looked at the folder of forms he'd filled out the night before by lamplight, and made a calculation. He could call in and cancel, or he could bring her along, keep her in the hallway with her coloring book, and take his shot. He chose the shot. He always chose the shot. The 32nd floor opened into a waiting area where 12 men were already seated or standing in small clusters. Brendan took them in with a single quiet sweep, the way he used to read a room in a different life, in a different country, in a different version of himself. Big men, most of them, broad through the shoulder. A few had the military haircut, the stillness in the jaw that came from training. A couple looked like they'd come straight from the gym. One was rolling his neck in slow circles, already performing. Nobody looked at Brendan when he walked in. Then somebody did. Then somebody else. And the room shifted in the way rooms do when something unexpected arrives. And the people in it haven't decided yet whether to feel threatened or amused. They decided quickly, amused. A man near the window, Vaughn Prescott, who would later introduce himself with the self-satisfied precision of someone who assumed you already knew the name, leaned over to the man beside him and said something low. The other man snorted. Vaughn didn't bother lowering his voice for the next part. Did somebody's kid get lost on the way to the daycare floor? A few men laughed. Not all of them, but enough. Lily's hand tightened around Brendan's fingers. He looked down at her. She was staring at Vaughn with the flat, unimpressed expression of a child who has sat through too many adult conversations, gone ugly, and learned to wait them out. Percy the rabbit dangled at her side. Brendan crouched down so he was at her eye level. "Hey," he said quietly, "there's a chair right outside the door. You remember what we said? Coloring book. Don't talk to strangers. Come get you if I need anything. Good. Are those men being mean to you?" He thought about it for a second. Not really. They're just surprised. She seemed to accept this. She took her coloring book from the canvas bag, tucked Percy under her arm, and went to the chair outside the door without another word. Brendan watched her go, then straightened up, turned around, and found Vaughn Prescott looking at him with the kind of smirk that people wear when they've already written the story and cast all the roles. Vaughn was tall, maybe 6'3", 230 pounds of deliberate maintenance. Hands like paddles. A jaw that could have been constructed for the purpose of intimidating smaller men. He was wearing a black compression shirt that left nothing to the imagination and everything to the ego. "That's cute," Vaughn said. "Bring your kid for moral support?" "She needed somewhere to be," Brendan said. He picked up a clipboard from the table near the door and found his name on the list. Brendan Cole. He checked it off. "What's your background?" said another man near the water cooler. He wasn't being hostile, just making conversation, the way you do when you're sizing up the room and trying to understand what you're looking at. "Security," Brendan said. "Private? Corporate? Some of both." Vaughan had drifted closer. He had the particular quality of a man who has never been told to stay where he was and wouldn't know how to respond if he were. "You don't look like security," he said. There was real amusement in his voice, no malice, which somehow made it worse. He wasn't even threatened, he was entertained. Brendan looked at him. "What does security look like?" Vaughan spread his hands, a gesture that took in his own body, the room, the other men, the general evidence. "This," he said. Brendan nodded slowly, as if considering this answer carefully. Then he wrote his emergency contact on the form and didn't say anything else. The others went in 2 at a time. They'd been told the evaluation format in the briefing email, a panel interview, a written assessment, and then a practical component, Strength, control, situational response. The man running it was a private security director named Edmund Falconer, who'd spent 15 years doing protective detail for people whose names appeared in the Financial Post. He had a thin face and a way of watching people that felt less like observation and more like accounting. He was adding up columns you couldn't see. Brendan sat in the waiting area and listened to the others. Vaughn was telling a story about a contract he'd had in Vancouver, private protection for a tech executive, an incident involving a disgruntled former employee, the way Vaughn had handled it. The men around him listened with the attentiveness of an audience that hasn't yet decided whether to be impressed or jealous. Vaughn had good rhythm. He knew how to hold a room. Brendan had known men like this his whole career. Some of them were exactly as competent as they appeared. Most weren't. He thought about Lily outside. He thought about the coloring book. She'd started a new one last week, Woodland Animals, and she'd been very deliberate about her color choices, insisting that the fox should be orange but the owl should be purple because owls can be whatever color they want. Dad. He thought about the drive down from Barrie that morning, the sun coming up over the 400, Lily asleep in the back seat with Percy, the Tim Hortons coffee going cold in the cup holder because he kept forgetting to drink it. He thought about 14 months ago, about the hospital in Ottawa, and the drive back alone and the 14-month-old sitting in the car seat who'd looked at him the whole way home as if she already understood that something enormous had shifted, and she was waiting to see what kind of man he was going to be about it. He'd been trying to answer that question every day since. Cole? The woman at the door, one of Falconer's staff, was looking at him. You're up. He stood, rolled his shoulders once, and walked in. The panel was 3 people, Falconer, a woman named Reese who handled HR for the client, and a man Brendan didn't recognize who had the particular stillness of someone used to being protected rather than protecting. The client, maybe, or a representative. He filed that away. The interview went the way these things go. Background, experience, situational judgment. Brendan answered steadily and without performance. He'd been trained at a young age to understand the difference between confidence and noise, and he'd spent the intervening years watching other men confuse the two. When Falconer asked him why he'd left his last position, Brendan said, "Family situation required me to be closer to home. I stayed closer to home. Now the situation has changed." "What situation?" Reese asked. "My wife passed, 14 months ago." A pause. Not the awkward kind, the kind that means someone is actually processing what they've heard. "I'm sorry," Reese said. "She meant it." "Thank you," Brendan said. He meant that too. They asked about the practical component. Did he have any physical limitations they should know about? He said no. They thanked him and told him to wait outside. He went back to the waiting area. Lily was still in the chair in the hallway, legs dangling, coloring with total concentration. She'd given the owl a purple and yellow striped pattern that Brendan thought was genuinely extraordinary. He told her so. She said, "I know," without looking up. He sat down inside and waited. Vaughn came out of the interview room 15 minutes later, looking satisfied. He glanced at Brendan. "You're still here, apparently. You know what the practical component is?" "I imagine we'll find out." Vaughan sat across from him. He had the quality some men develop after a certain kind of success. Not cruelty, exactly, but a casual willingness to diminish whoever happened to be in the chair across from them. It wasn't personal. It was just how they measured the room. "You actually do protective work?" Vaughn asked. Not aggressive, curious. The way a surgeon might be curious about someone who claimed to perform surgery with kitchen equipment. "Yes," Brendan said. "Where?" "A few places. Last domestic contract was in Toronto. Before that I was overseas." Vaughan raised an eyebrow. "Military? Contractor? Which firm?" Brendan named it. Vaughan's expression shifted slightly, barely perceptible, the kind of micro-movement you only catch if you've been trained to look for it. The name meant something to him. He covered it quickly. "Huh," he said. And then, because he was Vaughn and he had an image to maintain. "Still, you've been out of the field for, what, over a year? Protective work changes fast. So do threats," Brendan said. "You adjust." Vaughan smiled and let it go. But the micro-movement had already happened, and Brendan had already seen it. The practical component was not what anyone had expected. Falconer stood at the front of a large, cleared space on the same floor, furniture pushed back, mats laid down, and explained it simply. "This is a control assessment," he said. "Not a fight. We're not interested in aggression. We're interested in how you neutralize a threat without escalating. The assessment involves a trained partner who will initiate contact. Your job is to control, contain, and de-escalate. No strikes. Control only." He let that settle. Some of the men relaxed. Some of them, the ones who'd been looking forward to something more theatrical, seemed faintly disappointed. Then he said, "Given the number of candidates, we'll be doing this in pairs." One controls while one acts as the aggressor, then you switch. He looked at his clipboard. Prescott and Cole. The room went quiet in the specific way it goes quiet when something interesting is about to happen. Brendan became aware that several men had pulled out their phones. Vaughn Prescott rolled his neck again, that same slow rotation from the waiting room, his ritual, his preparation, and stepped onto the mat with the easy confidence of a man who had never once doubted his physical presence in a room. Brendan stepped on from the other side. He was aware, somewhere in the back of his processing, of Lily in the hallway chair. He was aware of Percy the rabbit. He was aware of the coloring book and the purple owl and the drive down from Barry and the 14-month-old who'd looked at him from the car seat like a question he had to keep answering. He was very calm. Falconer said, "Prescott, you're the aggressor first. Cole, you control." Vaughan took his stance. He was trained. You could see it in the mechanics of how he moved, where his weight settled, how his hands came up. He'd done this before. He was good at it. And he was going to be thorough, because Brendan Cole was standing across from him, and Vaughn wanted everyone in the room to understand something clearly. He came forward fast. Shoulder drop, weight shift, the kind of drive-through that's designed to overwhelm with mass and momentum. Brendan was not there. It happened in the space between one breath and the next. He'd slipped left, not backward, not bracing, sideways, and used the geometry of Vaughn's own commitment against him. His hand found Vaughn's wrist, his other arm found the shoulder, and then something shifted in the architecture of weight and leverage. And Vaughn Prescott, 230 pounds of deliberate maintenance, was face down on the mat with his right arm controlled at an angle that made moving a very unpleasant idea. Brendan held it for exactly 3 seconds, long enough to be clear. Not 1 second longer he released. Stepped back, returned to neutral. The room was completely silent. Vaughn got up slowly. His face was doing complicated things. He stood on the mat for a moment, and to his credit, genuine credit, Brendan thought, he didn't perform outrage or denial. He just stood there, recalibrating something. "Switch," Falconer said. His voice was perfectly even, but his pen had stopped moving on the clipboard. They switched. Vaughn controlled. Brendan initiated contact, and Vaughn managed it, adequately, professionally. It was textbook. It was solid. In any other pairing, it would have been the most impressive thing in the room. It wasn't the most impressive thing in the room. When they stepped off the mat, Falconer made a note and moved on to the next pair without comment. But Reese, the HR woman, was watching Brendan with the expression of someone who has just revised their spreadsheet. Vaughn walked to the water cooler. He poured a cup, drank it, poured another. Then he turned and looked at Brendan across the room with an expression that had shed its earlier layers. The amusement, the performance, the casual authority. What was underneath was simpler and more honest. The look of a man who has just learned something he didn't know before and is deciding what to do with the information. He gave a single, small nod. Brendan nodded back. The rest of the afternoon unfolded in the particular way that consequential days do. Ordinary on the surface, every minute loaded with weight underneath. Brendan picked up coffee from a machine in the hallway and brought Lily a hot chocolate she held in both hands like it was precious. She showed him the pages she'd colored. The fox was very orange. The owl had expanded its color palette to include teal. "That's a good owl," he said. "He's called Bernard," she told him. "Of course he is." They sat in the hallway together for 40 minutes while the last assessments finished. Nobody paid much attention to them. A few of the men who walked past glanced at Brendan differently now, not with the amused dismissal from the waiting room, but with something quieter, something closer to recalibration. One of them, a younger man named Whitmore who'd been polite from the beginning, stopped and asked him where he'd trained. Brendan told him. Whitmore nodded slowly. "I've heard of those guys," he said. "Most people haven't." "Yeah." Whitmore glanced at Lily, then back. "She doing okay?" "She's great," Brendan said. And then, "Thanks for asking." Whitmore nodded again and went back inside. At 4:15, Falconer came into the hallway. He was alone. He had a specific kind of walk, efficient, no extra movement, and he stopped in front of Brendan and looked at him for a moment without speaking, which Brendan had learned years ago was simply how Falconer processed. He'd read an article about the man years back, some profile in a trade publication. He thought about mentioning this and decided against it. "Where were you trained?" Falconer asked. Same question as Whitmore, different register. Brendan told him. Something moved in Falconer's thin face. Not surprise, more like confirmation. "I thought so," he said, the wrist positioning. "We had an instructor come through from that program when I was with the RCMP. It looks wrong until it works. That's the idea," Brendan said. Falconer looked at Lily. She had moved on to a porcupine and was selecting her colors with tremendous gravity. "How old?" he asked. 7. "How long have you been doing this alone?" 14 months. Falconer nodded. He looked at his clipboard, though Brendan doubted he needed to read anything on it. The contract is 12 months initially, possibility of renewal. The client is a family. There are children. The primary threat profile is, he paused. I'll be honest with you. We've had candidates who were more physically imposing, I know, Brendan said. I haven't had a candidate who put Prescott down in under 2 seconds with a textbook Kuzushi entry in probably a decade. Maybe longer. Brendan didn't say anything. There wasn't anything to say. Falconer clicked his pen once, twice. The position includes accommodation, downtown near a good school district. He glanced at Lily again. That might be a relevant detail. It was a relevant detail. It was the most relevant detail Brendan had heard in 14 months. He felt something happen in his chest that he wouldn't have been able to name precisely. Not hope, exactly, because hope felt too fragile for what this was. Something sturdier. The sense of a floor reappearing under your feet after a long time of not being sure it was there. Yes, he said, that's relevant. I'll be making calls this evening. Expect to hear from us tomorrow morning. Falconer extended his hand. Brendan shook it. Falconer had a very firm grip and didn't try to make it a competition, which Brendan found quietly impressive. Then Falconer looked at Lily. Nice to meet you, he said. Lily looked up from the porcupine. His name is Bernard, she said, pointing at the owl on the previous page. Falconer studied the owl for a moment. Good name, he said, and walked away. They drove back to Barrie in the early evening. The 400 was moving well for once, the last of the sun going sideways across the fields. That particular quality of Ontario light in late afternoon that makes everything look like a painting some finished in a hurry. Lily had fallen asleep within 20 minutes, purse tucked under her chin, the coloring book open on her lap to Bernard the owl. Brendan drove and didn't think about tomorrow. This was a skill he'd spent years developing, the ability to stay in the present moment, to not mortgage the current minute against a future that hadn't arrived yet. It had served him well in places where the future was genuinely uncertain. It served him less well at 3 in the morning in a too-quiet apartment, which was why 3 in the morning had become his least favorite hour. But right now, in the truck with the sun going down and Lily breathing softly in the back seat, he managed it. He thought instead about the room that morning. The way it had smelled, money and contempt. He thought about Vaughn Prescott's face right before he'd come forward on the mat. The absolute certainty of a man who has decided the outcome before the thing has happened. Brendan had seen that certainty before, in different rooms, different countries, different people. He had no particular feeling about it. It was just a data point. It told you where the commitment was, and where the gap was, and what you had to do with the geometry. He thought about Falconer's voice when he'd said downtown, near a good school district. He'd been deliberate about it. He was a man who chose his words with precision, and he'd chosen to say that, and he'd looked at Lily when he said it. Brendan had spent 14 months in survival mode. Not dramatic survival. The quiet, grinding kind that doesn't make for good stories. Just the daily act of making sure a little girl had breakfast and clean clothes, and someone to check for monsters under the bed, and someone to notice when she was sad, even when she said she wasn't. He'd taken contracts when he could get them, turned down ones that required travel, burned through the savings with the methodical care of a man watching a candle. Mrs. Kowalski had been a godsend. The building on Dunlop Street was cheap for a reason, but it was theirs. He'd made it work. He hadn't been sure some mornings if making it work was enough, if the thing he was building, in the absence of the person who was supposed to build it with him, was recognizable as a life, yet or just the scaffolding of one. The truck moved up the highway. Lily slept. He thought, downtown, near a good school district. He thought, 12 months initially, possibility of renewal. Ha thought about his wife, Kara, her name was Kara, and what she would have said about today. She'd have laughed at the part with Vaughn Prescott. She'd have laughed and then immediately asked if the man was okay, because she was constitutionally unable to feel good about someone else's embarrassment, without also feeling a little bad about it. She'd have wanted to know everything Lily had colored. She'd have asked about Bernard the Owl by name. He reached back and gently closed the coloring book so it wouldn't fall, careful not to wake Lily. The sun was almost gone. The 400 stretched ahead, the lights coming on in the dark. His phone rang at 9:14 the next morning while Lily was eating cereal and arguing with Percy the rabbit about something he couldn't follow. It was a Toronto number. He walked to the kitchen window and answered it. "Cole," said Falconer's voice. "The position is yours if you want it." Brendan stood at the window and looked at the parking lot below. The same parking lot he'd looked at for 14 months. The cracked asphalt, the single maple that had somehow survived being planted in a concrete divider, the neighbors' cars. Ordinary and specific and very real. "I want it," he said. "Good. We'll send the contract today." Start date is the 1st of the month. Housing is included from the 15th. Do you have questions? He had 100 questions. He asked the 3 that mattered most, got clear answers to all 3, and thanked Falconer before he hung up. He stood at the window for another minute. Then he walked to the table and sat down across from his daughter, who had apparently just won her argument with Percy and was now eating cereal with the satisfaction of someone who has prevailed. "Hey," he said. She looked up. "We're going to move. To Toronto. You'll have a new school." Lily considered this with the serious deliberation she brought to all major decisions, including color choices for fictional woodland animals. She looked at Percy. She looked back at Brendan. "Will there be a park?" Falconer mentioned a park. "I'm pretty sure there's a park." "Okay," she said. And then, returning to her cereal, "Can Bernard come?" It took him a second. The owl. The purple and teal owl in the coloring book named Bernard, who could be whatever color he wanted. "Yeah," Brendan said. "Bernard can come." She nodded, satisfied. She ate her cereal. Outside, the maple in the parking lot divider caught the morning light and went briefly gold. One of those small, unremarkable moments that you notice only when you're paying attention, only when you've come through enough to understand that ordinary and good are sometimes the same thing. Brendan looked at it. He let himself look at it for a long time. Then he got up and started making a list.